I have watched the trailer for the Gilmore Girls revival about 10 times over the past 2 days, and I regret nothing. It looks so good, guys. It looks so good. Anyway, hi, my name is Jess and welcome to my new channel, Reads with a Ravenclaw. I thought it would be a really good idea to start my channel off with a monthly wrap-up video so you can see the sort of things I like to read and the sort of way I like to think about books. Last October was actually a really good reading month for me. I read 5 books, some poetry, and I'm also gonna like throw in a little honorary review there because one of these books I finished on the 1st of October, which I think counts as an October read. If I was reading it in October, it counts. It counts. I really enjoyed the books I read this month. There's actually not one on this list that I would give a bad review to. So the first book I read this month was Bridget Jones's Diary by Helen Fielding. And I'm sure the majority of you already know what Bridget Jones's Diary is about, but in case you don't, I will give you a little synopsis. It is the diary of a woman named Bridget Jones, would you believe, who is in her 30s, she's living in London, and she's single, and it really just follows her experiences over a year of dating and of friends, and it was really fun to read this. So the movie Bridget Jones's Baby came out a couple of months ago, and I went to see it with my mum and my sister, and it just filled me with so much nostalgia because the film of Bridget Jones's Diary is one of my ultimate feel-good films. I watch it whenever I'm feeling sad, and I also feel like Bridget Jones's Diary is a really big part of our culture. She's kind of known as an every woman, and I feel like I've heard so many women over my lifetime just be like, oh yeah, I totally am like Bridget Jones. I feel like everyone has a bit of Bridget in them, and that's just become a really big cultural thing. So I was super eager to read this and find out where it all came from, and I really enjoyed this book. Helen Fielding gives Bridget such a distinct voice, which is a really amazing thing when you think about it, because she's very distinct, yet so many people relate to her. The humour is also exactly what you expect. It's a very funny book. It had me grinning and laughing on so many occasions. It did in some places, and I feel kind of guilty saying this, feel just a little bit dated, which I suppose isn't surprising because it did come out during the 90s or early 2000s. I'm not actually sure. It came out a couple of decades ago now though, and I think you can definitely tell, and whilst maybe some of the cultural references therefore felt a bit off for me personally, the fact that Bridget is still such a relatable character I think says a lot about her and about Helen Fielding's writing. I will say that I do prefer the film to the book, which is a really rare thing for me, but with the book, I just felt like some of the secondary characters were flat. So I felt like her two love interests, Mark Darcy and Daniel Cleaver, were actually more believable in the film than they are in the book. So a lot of the diary entries are really short, which made it just kind of easy to put down sometimes, because an entry would maybe be a paragraph long and it would just be very easy to think, okay, I finished that, and shut the book. It ultimately left me feeling a tiny bit disappointed just because I set my expectations so high because of the film. That being said, I did still enjoy it and I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The next book I read this month was my highest ranked book of this month, and that is The Dream Thieves by Maggie Stiefvater. I am finally reading The Raven Cycle, guys. It's literally been years. It's been years since I brought this book. So The Raven Cycle itself, in its most basic sense, follows a bunch of teenagers as they hunt for the remains of the dead Welsh king, as it's believed that the one who finds those remains will be granted some sort of favour. Anyway, The Dream Thieves follows one of those characters who was introduced in the last book. It follows Ronan, who was actually my favourite character in the last book, so I was super excited to hear more about him, and this book did not disappoint. Ronan himself is such a unique character. He's someone who you just can't sum up in a few words. It would be really hard to sum him up in this review. He just has so much anger and frustration, and it's really hard to see past that in the Raven Boys, I think, but in this book you got to see so much more of his life, his family. You got to understand more about his past. My favourite thing about this series so far though is definitely Maggie Stiefvater's writing. This is the first book of hers I've read, or this is the first series of hers I've read, and it won't be the last one because she's just got the most gorgeous writing style, you guys. It's so beautiful and poetic, but it's not poetic in a way that's difficult to read, if you know what I mean. I feel like in so many classic books there'd be this absolutely gorgeous lyrical prose, but it will be kind of a bit heavy and maybe hard to follow, but that is not what this writing is like at all. There were so many times in this book where I would come across a quote and I just have to put the book down for a few seconds and let myself absorb that quote because it's just so gorgeous. Atmosphere is another thing she does really well. This book is set in Virginia and it's got this kind of, I wouldn't say gothy, but this eerie vibe to it that's just so perfect for the type of magic that she writes about. I'm aware that this mini review is kind of vague, but there's really nothing that I can say about this without giving spoilers for the first book. I intend to read the next 2 books in the future, so I'll probably do some sort of bigger series review at that point, but until then I gave this book a 4.75 out of 5 stars, and it was my favourite book of this month. Next up, I was on a sort of fantasy train, so I decided to read Uprooted by Naomi Novik. So Uprooted is based on Eastern European myths. I want to say Polish myths or Polish folklore, but I'm not 100% sure. So Uprooted follows this young woman called Agnieszka who lives in a village that is being terrorised by a forest. Yeah, you heard that right. She basically lives next to this evil forest that kind of turns people into trees, which sounds really strange, but honestly, it's so frightening. I never thought that a forest could be a scary villain, but it actually is. Anyway, near Agnieszka's village lives a wizard called the Dragon, and in exchange for his help with the forest, every few years the dragon comes along and takes a girl from her village. This book was so good. It was so unlike anything I've ever read in the fantasy genre because it feels like a very dark fairy tale, but it doesn't feel like any of the other fairy tale retellings I've ever read. And it was so interesting because it had all of the whimsicalness of a fairy tale, but it was also very dark. Narrator Agnieszka was also so charming. I loved how headstrong she was and how stubborn, and I loved the focus that this book had on her friendship with Kazia. Or Kazia, I don't know how, I'm so bad with names, it's ridiculous. I was pronouncing Agnieszka all the way up until the end of the book when they have the little thing saying how you're actually meant to pronounce it. Serious question, why do fantasy books always put those at the end after I've been pronouncing names of people and places wrong for the entire book? Anyway, I did love how much friendship was a part of it. I really thought that it was going to be more centred on romance, but honestly the romance that does occur in this novel is quite a small part of it, I'd say, in comparison to the main story of the village and the forest and the friendship between Kazia and Agnieszka. The magic system was also super interesting. It's quite vague, I think, but this book didn't need to have it be super laid out and detailed. I think the sort of fairy tale atmosphere meant that it didn't matter that the system itself wasn't so fleshed out. A lot of it's to do with language and the way you pronounce words and the way they come out, and I just thought it was really nice how Naomi Novik made magic seem like this sort of craft. Some criticisms I did have is I feel like the middle bit dragged a little bit. It was the beginning and the end that held my attention the most, and also the character of the dragon, who's the wizard, disappears for a good chunk of the book. Well, he doesn't disappear, but he's not there for a lot of the book, and I would have liked to have found out more about him than we did in the end, I think. But overall, I really enjoyed this and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Secret History by Donna Tartt. So The Secret History follows the character of Richard, who attends an elite boarding school in New Hampshire where he studies ancient Greek, which is a very small class, also a very elite class. And right at the start of this novel, it's revealed that a character called Bunny Corcoran, who's one of his classmates, is dead. And this novel is essentially going back to the start of that year and working out exactly how that happened. Donna Tartt's writing is just beautiful, and the way that she crafted the sort of mystery of this story and let everything unfold, it was just so good. You got the sense that she was just moving things at exactly the rate she wanted to, if you know what I mean. Just everything felt so masterful and meticulously planned, and I loved watching it unfold. This book was also really interesting in that it looked at beauty and how we find things beautiful in a really interesting way. I also really liked the presence of ancient Greek in the novel, little bits of that she wove in, and the little themes that come from those tales that she wove in as well. I thought it was really interesting. Having said that, this book was long and it did kind of drag in places, particularly again for me in the middle chunk. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I don't have a physical copy of this here to show you, but I read some poetry by Philip Larkin this month. He's quite a cynical poet. I think if you've ever studied his poetry in school or in college or anything, you'll understand what I mean when I say this. But I actually came to really appreciate that because he's just so... he calls things like he sees them, and it makes his poetry feel intensely personal but distant at the same time. My favourites of Philip Larkin were definitely the poems where he was more anecdotal. One that we read in college and that I found again in this anthology was Wild Oats, and I quite like that one. I like the way that he's just so dry and witty about things, yet he still manages to bring up these emotions that just hit me hard. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed my little forage into poetry this month, and I ended up giving those poems that I read, which were about, I think I read about 10 to 15 in the end, a 4 out of 5 stars as a collective. Next Next up, because I was feeling the Greek theme this month, I read this book. I read The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. This book is a retelling of the story of the hero Odysseus, but it's told from the perspective of his wife Penelope from the afterlife. Also, every few chapters there is a poem told collectively from the perspective of Penelope's maids, which I thought was really interesting, that balance between prose and poetry. It took a while to get used to, but in the end I really ended up appreciating it. The poetry prose balance was also really nice, because when you're listening to Penelope's perspective, I think it's quite bare bones, that style. She's not super flowery with Penelope. Penelope's actually quite a dry and sarcastic character. Then you switch to the poetry, and that is really lyrical and lovely, and it just made for such a nice balance in the story. I did have some issues with this, however. I felt like the last chunk of the book was a little bit rushed, and there were some things which I can't talk about without spoiling this book that I feel were just skirted over, even though it was made out in the start of the story that there were going to be these really important elements. When it actually comes to it, there were things that I feel like Margaret Atwood didn't go into enough detail with. Whilst I enjoyed this book a lot, I was also a little bit disappointed, because though I loved it, I didn't love it as much as I loved The Handmaid's Tale and The Blind Assassin. I ended up giving this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Finally this month I was still sort of riding that fantasy high, so I decided to pick up Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Six of Crows is set in the same world as the Grisha trilogy, but in a different area of that world, and it follows a young criminal named Kaz Brecker. Kaz is offered an insane amount of money to put together a crew and carry off this impossible heist. I loved it, and I was really unsure about picking this book up because I read the first book in the Grisha trilogy, which is Shadow and Bone, and I wasn't the biggest fan, to be honest. I like Leigh Bardugo's writing style, but the story itself kind of was a bit lackluster for me. But when I heard the concept of magical heist, I couldn't not. I couldn't not. This was about a gazillion times better than the Grisha trilogy, and I'm not trying to slate the Grisha trilogy in any way, because I know that a lot of people love that trilogy, but for me personally, everything just felt more. The writing style was better, the characters were more for me. It was just so good. It was on another level, in my opinion. Something that's been really praised about this novel, and something that I loved as well, was the diversity of the characters. You have 6 point of view characters, and not only does Leigh Bardugo manage to give every single one of them a super distinct voice, all of them have really distinct backgrounds. 2 of the 6 main characters are people with colour, and there's also lots of different sexualities and body sizes and personalities, and it was just so amazing. It was just representative of any world, I think, and that's something that fantasy doesn't always do, but this one did so brilliantly. The plot itself was also really clever. I'm always trying, when I read this book, to figure out the twist before we get to the twist, and it's like this little challenge I set myself, but this book was just twist after twist after twist after twist, and you couldn't predict them all. Her plotting was absolutely excellent, as was her writing style. It's so rich and really well suited for a fantasy world, I think. Another thing I loved about this book was that the characters were not good people. I feel like in the Grisha trilogy, Alina, who's the main character, you know, she's the hero, she's the chosen one, she is a good person. These people are really questionable. I think my favourite character was probably Kaz, even though he was just super despicable. He was so unlike any other character that I've ever read, and I loved him. And I gave Six of Crows a 4.5 out of 5 stars, which makes it my 2nd favourite book of the month, just behind the Dream Thieves. So yes, this was my October wrap up. I'd love to know what books you've been reading in October, so leave a comment down below. But until next time, thank you so much for watching this first video of mine, and goodbye.